One. All right, so I'm chilling with an incredible person right now here on this Zoom call during these lockdown times. She's an incredible individual. Her name is Ayanda Charlie. She's a freelance content producer, a musician, which is the best part about it. And she's part of an incredible duo called Thesis ZA. And she's also the host of our podcast called Enroute. How are you doing, Ayanda?
I'm well. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. How are you?
I'm great. I'm super excited for the launch of your podcast. I'm excited for the launch of everyone else's podcast. And I think it's going to be such an incredible time for audiences to get to understand you more and get to know your content more. And like, as I dive into it, I really want to start with this question here. And this is something I've taken from your concept notes. And you said that you are a multi-hyphenate individual, right? And from my understanding, this means it's someone that is multi-talented, multi-skilled, and someone that is actively vocationally running these skills at the same time. So this is someone that would be a content producer and a musician and a this and a this and a that, right? That's a very fantastic thing objectively. And I want all my kids to be multi-hyphenates, promise you. But what does it mean for the question, what are you doing with your life?
Being multi-hyphenate it's actually not, number one, a very rare thing. I think a lot of us in this time and for our generation are multi-hyphenate. I think
Absolutely.
Forces like the economy, education, depending on what kind you've got and what level of education you have allowed us, and really our access to technology and all these technological advances have allowed for many of us to be multi-hyphenate.
Yeah.
But in terms of work, being multi-hyphenate means not just being interested in multiple things, but actually pursuing them at the same time, or interchangeably. And whereas some people may be interested in multiple things, they might pursue them linearly over a lifetime. So one thing at a time, one thing after the other. What being a multi-hyphenate means for the question of what are you doing with your life is an interesting, exciting, but also challenging topic to tackle, because especially for, I think, people such as us in this part of the world, where approaches to work by our parents and our guardians and generations that precede us are very conservative.
Yes.
What are you going to do with your life as a multi-hyphenate is a hard question to answer, because you are exploring as you go. You are figuring out what it is that you like. You're making connections between things that never have been made, connections that never have been connected before.
Yeah.
And you are kind of, treading and forming your own path as you go. So it makes for an interesting, exciting, but not very neat, I guess, approach to ideas of career, to ideas of expertise. What are you going to master? Some people feel that you can't be a jack of all trades because you're not going to be able to master any. And I completely disagree.
Yeah.
I think that, you get so much fuel and inspiration as when you are working on different things at different times. I read something that said that if one thing isn't working for multi-hyphenates, they're able to look to something else in their life, and if that thing is working, they're able to bring that energy and export it into other parts of their lives. So you're not somebody you're probably less likely to come across like a early kind of midlife crisis where you go, oh, I've been pursuing this one thing since I was a child, and all of a sudden it isn't working for me, and you have nowhere else to look, and you kind of have a career crisis. I think that's less likely for people who are multi-hyphenates.
And so, and that's where the real tension lies, in the fact that like we exist in a system and an education system that prepares us for a linear trajectory in life. But we're living in a real world that is so dynamic that appeals to every sense of complexity that we have as human beings. And like living a multi-hyphenate life is like appealing to your greatest complexities, which is something that we should be embracing in this era. I would think. And I can imagine though, like this question, what would you do with your life, you know, is even harder for a creative in the space, someone who is of creative breed, isn't it?
Oh, I mean, I think yes. I think in the sense that being a creative has always been a challenging thing in terms of, you know, the conversation of career and what you're going to do with
Absolutely.
your life, right? And how you're going to make money. I think
In the
even
first
if
place.
you are, you know, just in the first place, even if you
Yeah.
were just like a concert pianist and that's what you're going to do,
Yeah.
there's a precarity that comes with it. But I think when you are creative is multi-hyphenate and is interested in different kinds of creative expressions, maybe even worse when you are creative who also is interested in things that don't really seem creative to other people. So it's like, oh, you're creative, but you also are a bookkeeper. Okay. Right? There's exactly. So I think that, you know, being multi-hyphenate is and the challenges that come with being a creative is compounded by being a multi-hyphenate.
Wow.
Because you just kind of feel, sometimes you yourself might not know. I mean, I don't for 1 second want to let anyone believe that I'm just always sure of what I'm doing and where I'm going.
Yeah.
It's probably much harder to know that, because I don't know where the next opportunity is going to come from. I have to make it for myself. And sometimes I have to convince people that what I'm pursuing is worthwhile.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And like, I think also, given the fact that we live in a capitalist society that prizes your ability to put food on the table over your ability to optimize yourself and self-actualize, it becomes even worse, because like the creative question, the being a creative question is tethered to how you're going to make that money though. Like
Exactly.
we hear you are a music producer, shout out to you, but like how are you going to make that money though? You know, and I can imagine like that's such an interesting, such a deep tension really that artists and creatives face, and even us entrepreneurs face, and we don't talk about it because simultaneously we exist in a LinkedIn and Instagram economy that that doesn't even give us the space to be real about these emotions, don't you think?
Exactly. And I'm so happy that you brought that out. You spoke about that tension of earning a living and being a creative, because and this is something that I explore with a lot of the people who come onto my show, right?
Yeah.
And because I like to speak to creatives, because work, and this is why I explain and kind of summarize the podcast as being one in which young people reckon with their relationship to work, especially creatives, because creativity is considered to be something that you do as a personal endeavor, that you explore your creativity for your own happiness, for your own fulfillment, and that work is something that's meant to be external to that. Now you look at like the past decade, right, and how we have the messaging around work has been about, you know, to pursue your passion and you'll never have to work a day in your life. And we're finding that people are trying to negotiate work into these passions and these creative pursuits. And we're trying to kind of form something where you don't really have to feel like your creativity is separate to your work.
Yeah.
But that poses a challenge when you are somebody who does want their creativity to belong to themselves, but who also is unable to live to live a life. I mean, of course, and that this is for everyone, to live a life where, you know, you kind of just, you know, throw caution to the wind and you don't really think about how you're going to make a living. Making a living is central, and capitalism makes it so. You have to be productive. I mean, you exist for utility. So those are the tensions that I explore in the podcast. You are creative. You're somebody who's madly what's that word? Industrious. Yeah. You are an entrepreneur, which I think is another form of creativity. Yeah. These are things that you do for yourself, because you cannot live a life that does not involve, in a great deal and to a great extent, being creative. And the tension of owning that, but also trading that.
So I think now we are bleeding very nicely into the actual concept that is your podcast. So just for audiences, tell us what Enroute is about.
Well, Enroute, to borrow from what I just talked about, is about figuring out our relationships to work as we make our way towards what we believe for ourselves to be our destinies, our purposes, and even just, en route to the pursuit of happiness, or en route along the way.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about, like, as we make our way towards what we believe is the promised land, how do we make sense of having to make a living? And what does that mean for our identities? How do we relate to ourselves and to the world as productive human beings and as creative human beings? And how can we, I don't like the word balance. I think balance is impossible. But how do we create harmony between what we have to do and what we want to do, in order to pay tax, but also to do justice to our existence?
Look, I think an ideal situation is one where we can just be as human beings, right? We can just be, and reaching our full potential and self-actualizing, correlates with our ability to feed ourselves and our families. That is truly the ideal world. And the reason why this podcast is so important is because there is no one that's living that life. There are so few people that are living a life where their innermost passions, their innermost beings, and their full sense of their humanity is congruent to their ability to feed themselves, feed their families, and for goodness sake, ensure that their families back home, Black tax-wise, are sorted, are safe, and are fine, right? So, like, this podcast is supremely, supremely, supremely important. And so the people that you would feature on the podcast, are you talking to creatives only? What's a creative actually? Like, what's the definition of a typical person that would feature on your podcast? Because I don't imagine like an accountant being on your podcast. Shout out to all the accountants in the world, but like, I don't think
no offense. So, it really is, I think I also like, I want to extend the definition and idea of creativity. And that's why I think borrowing the term multi-hyphenate is so useful, because you then start to imagine somebody who isn't just doing one thing. And I think the creativity really is in the way that you interchangeably or even kind of collaboratively work these different parts of yourself. So you could be anybody really, as long as you are exploring new ways of relating to work, building new pathways towards a career that you imagine for yourself. And so it is going to involve content creators. It is going to involve people who are in traditional media. It's going to involve sometimes entrepreneurs. And I actually am on the hunt for, accountants who don't look like what we were taught accountants look like. I'm looking for people who are finding for themselves what life and work life should look like. So I think that's really where the creativity is. And I want this podcast to, alongside everything else that it does, to open up our ideas of what creativity can be. Somebody, I think it was one of an Oprah interview, said that just like survival is creativity.
Wow.
Like that's, and I think that you can think of that in so many different kinds of ways. And I want to explore the ways that you can do that.
Yeah. And I love the fact that the podcast really lies on the pursuit of happiness, just as a fundamental principle, because that's, as free people, because that's another concept that like is been thrown away, like that's been thrown around all the time, and like ever since the dawn of democracy, freedom. What does real freedom mean? And I think and I think that's another question, a big question that your podcast would be answering as well, for people who consider themselves free, and for people who consider themselves entrapped by a system, that an education system, a vocational system, a capitalist system, that limits their ability to express themselves at full throttle just because they don't have enough money to do so.
Yes.
I can't wait for it.
money is such, and it, success, money, happiness are so conflated in our culture.
Yeah.
And when you're a creative, your happiness is attached to your success in terms of how successfully you express through your work, and how successfully you do justice to your ideas. That whole conundrum of matching your skill to your taste level.
Yeah.
And yeah, so those are the kinds of things that I want to look at as well, right? Like what do we attach success to? I mean, you speak about being trapped in systems. Do you equate success or define success as being something that looks like, kind of reaching the top echelons of the company you work at when you aren't even happy at that company? I mean, things like that. And how do you work yourself out of that? We've seen in the past, 5, 6, 7 years, young people in our country challenge the status quo. Absolutely. And go, I don't want our institutions to look this way. We want to be in these institutions, we want to participate, but we can't be our full selves. What does that look like? Right? So now that we've done that and we've shook the table, how do we then dress the table? Or, what does the next table look like? Like, what do we do to negotiate happiness, success, and comfort financially into these things and ourselves ultimately?
Yeah. And you're touching on such a very, very cool subject. And what you've also noted in your concept note is that the podcast itself is purposefully socially conscious.
Yes.
Because again, I mean, you and I have had this conversation privately. We are the post fees must fall and roads must fall generation. We were the millennials that were within that actual struggle, that was there dismantling that system, transforming it and agitating for that kind of environment. So how important is it for, this podcast to be reflective of as many identities as possible, and just like assert the freedom of others insofar as its tone and texture? How important is it?
Yeah, it's paramount. It's this, I think any kind of alternative pursuit, right, in terms of the spaces that we create. I mean, this network is a space for people who want to make media products, and who aren't interested or aren't able to join traditional establishments of media to kind of find a way to make space for themselves and make space for others like them and others who aren't like them. I think for my podcast, because I'm talking about identity in relation to work, identity in relation to externality.
Sure.
Identities and having a myriad of them is so important, because I'm not just talking about how Black women negotiate themselves into spaces. I'm talking about how, queer people may negotiate themselves into spaces.
Absolutely.
Work is such, I mean, if you think about the ways in which work dictates how we present in the world.
Oh, yes.
It's how sometimes most people are raised to be hireable and employable, right? And some identities, we can't pretend as though all identities are allowed in the workplace as they are. And so you'll find that many young people are making for themselves spaces outside of established institutions. So I think this podcast, if it does anything, I want it to be a place where we all come to, different kinds of people, come to begin to imagine how they can build for themselves the lives that they imagine without having to sacrifice, fulfilling career goals, ideas of happiness.
Sure.
I want all of us to exchange ideas about how we can continue to expand this world and make it make space for us.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's a collaborative effort. And, not necessarily taking it upon yourself to answer these very big questions, but you're creating a safe space for as many individuals and as many identities as possible to answer these big and broad questions as we chart our way towards the future. That's so incredible. Just
that means,
yes.
Just before your second last question, what that means is that this is not a quick 20-minute, per episode, per conversation show.
Yeah.
It's a long form. It's like I try to keep it maximum 15 minutes. But what we're doing here is that we're talking, this is for people who actually want to engage conversations, people who want to glean. These are not your quick sound bites, chopped up into things that you can easily take in and apply. Hopefully it can, I wanted to offer value. But I think because these conversations are so about people making sense of internal things and internal ideas and concepts, they have to kind of be laid bare and explored and need to dive into them as deeply as we possibly can. Incredible. So that's what it means.
Yes. And like that really like fits so nicely into my next question, which is, awesome. What does a typical episode look like from a structure, just a blow-by-blow point of view? What can we expect as audiences?
Well, so that I don't defeat myself out of the endeavor completely, I'm allowing myself and my guests to define it as we go. You've mentioned that like zero is definitely about that, like figuring out what it looks like, letting it sort of grow bones. But essentially what each episode is going to be about is, a given guest will come and talk about their relationship to work. From the beginning of your endeavor into the work world until now, the ways in which you have been challenged in the workplace, how you have continued to define how you relate to work, and ultimately what you were doing to tread a path for yourself and a future, and create space for yourself in an industry or even within multiple industries. So we start off with very much, blow by blow of how someone made it into their work. And then we speak about the kind of politics that they find themselves in when they are in the workplace. And then we move on to what they've done with that, where they see themselves going. And all of that kind of keeping in mind and really front of mind the idea that all this happens within a political context.
Absolutely.
Right? So whether it's in the past or in the present, it happens within a political context. What does it mean to be a freelancer in 2020? It's something that we explore. During this pandemic, what does that look like? What does it mean to be a freelancer in the media industry, in the context of like the demise of the business model that media had for so many years, was built on?
400 years, a century.
Exactly. So things like that, right? And I trust and believe and hope that as we go along, that'll crystallize into things that the audience can help define in terms of format and structure and topics and like what we really want to get out of it. But that's what you can hope for and look forward to in these next few episodes.
Incredible. Last question. What does this podcast mean to you? To you as the podcaster, as Ayanda, as a musician, as a multi-hyphenate, as you?
Well, well, for me, this is one of my multiple pursuits, like kind of pursuits, endeavors, projects, things that I do. Excuse me, I'm leaking. What this podcast means to me is an opportunity, I think, to make sense for things for myself. I think for a long time I've had these questions in my mind and I've wanted to engage others, about them. And I found myself many a times being the only one who's thinking about this, being the only one who's in this conundrum. I think I am surrounded by people who've known what they wanted to do for a long time and who are really good at it, and who are just who know exactly where they're going. And I'm somebody who's always just wanted to learn as much as I can, do as much as I can, explore the full breadth of myself through my work. So this podcast is really an opportunity for me to take that kind of interior conversation outward.
Yes.
I also want answers. I'm also looking for ideas.
Yes.
And
yes.
I look forward to collaborating with others on that. And it's also for me, I think, a platform to explore my talents and explore my skills, right? And see what else I can do, because that's what I'm constantly trying to do.
Wow. Look, Ayanda, I wish you the greatest of luck. I'm supremely excited because I resonate with this podcast as someone that has jumped from one university degree to another, as someone who's left school altogether, as someone who started a business and is starting multiple. You know, I truly and deeply resonate with this content, and like, you know, may it grow, because there's so many people like us, and there are so many people who are just simply and purely in the pursuit of happiness. And may this podcast really do what it can to help them answer that question. What am I going to do with my life?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the platform. Thank you for opening up this network for us to explore questions such as mine.
It's a huge pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.